Hi everyone. In this video I'm going to show you some basic techniques for working with watercolors. I'm going to talk about wet on wet, wet on dry, glazing, and then using some additional bits to help create textures with salt, cheesecloth, and plastic wrap. So the first three I'm going to talk about are the basics of watercolor. These are the things you need to understand so that you really get how watercolor works. So to start with, let's do wet on dry. So what that means is we have wet paint on a dry piece of watercolor paper. So all I need to do is take some water and get my paint wet. And then I can paint onto the paper. So you'll notice that that has a really crisp edge. It's sharp. One thing that you want, if you're using wet on dry, you're generally wanting to have a hard edge. So if you're trying to paint really large areas with just one color, wet on dry probably isn't the best option for you. But if you are trying to get details, wet on dry is a pretty good option. And then that moves us to wet on wet. So what that means is we have wet paper and wet paint. So what I'm going to do is wet my paper, and then I'm just going to introduce some color into it. If you're working in a large area, you're going to need to work quickly and maybe have your paint prepared. So I'm just going to introduce my color to the water. And you can see how it's starting to bleed outwards. Basically, when we work with wet on wet, our color is going to just move around on the paper where it is wet and then stop where it's dry. So this will help fill in large areas of color, and it's going to help give you sort of smooth areas. So you won't see as many brush strokes if you work in this sort of style. It's also good if you want to like blend different colors together. Basically, the key of wet on wet is to let the water do the work for you. So it doesn't really require too much effort to make things happen. Next we have glazing, and glazing is just like layering washes of color. So you could work wet on wet, you could work wet on dry. It doesn't really matter. I guess just depending on what sort of technique you're trying to achieve. But I'm just going to let this sit here for a minute so that it'll dry. Then I can go in and glaze over the top of it. In the meantime, I'll talk a little bit about my paints. I use primarily Daniel Smith watercolors. They're definitely artist grade, so if you're just getting started, you don't feel the need to spend a lot of money on them. I've invested in these over a number of years, so I'm finally at a point where I've got a lot of colors and I really like my palette that I work with. But what I think is really cool about Daniel Smith colors is they have this stuff called Primatech, and what's really cool about Primatech is they're actually made out of ground up natural pigments, just like the old school paint. So for example, this right here is made out of ground up amethyst, which is pretty awesome. What's awesome about this paint is that it sparkles. So when you get up close to it, you can really see the sparkle of the paint inside of it. There's jade and lapis and garnet, all kinds of really awesome pigments that you can choose from. So I've always really loved rocks, so I get really excited when I see a paint made out of a rock and I can identify the rock. It's pretty cool. So this is the garnet right there. I like to just drop paint in or drop water into my paint sometimes to see what happens to it. Um, and doing that actually creates another kind of technique, which we would call a backrun. So a backrun happens when you have some damp paper and you introduce water or another kind of wet paint into it. And the more wet color or just water that you introduce starts to push its way into the less dry or less wet areas. And it creates this sort of like feathered look in it. And we call that a backrun. So now I'm moving back to glazing. I've noticed that this is dried. You can glaze with just one color. You can glaze with a variety of colors. Basically, it just depends on what you're doing. So think of it like layers of transparent glass put one over the top of another. So you'll be able to see through it to create a variety of colors. So it's like you're blending your colors, but you're doing it by layering them on top of each other instead of mixing them together. This creates sort of a really nice transparency. I use this a lot when I'm doing skin tones and working with light and shadows, stuff like that. I feel like glazing works really well in those sorts of instances. So I'll come back to this again once this guy dries, which shouldn't take too long. I didn't use a lot of water in it. But I mean, you can glaze forever, just layers and layers and layers on top of it. And I think that's really what creates a lot of depth in watercolor is with glazing. So let's get into some of these textural things here. With salt, I love working with salt because it creates this great texture that looks like frost on a window. So I'm just going to do a quick wet on wet wash. I feel like certain colors seem to work really well with salt, certain colors don't, but I do know that cerulean blue works very well with salt. One thing you need to have in order for this to work is you need to have enough paint and enough water on here for this to do its job. And depending on the type of salt you have, whether you have, table salt, my nice T-Rex salt shaker will give you smaller little crystals. Whereas if you use like sea salt, that's going to give you some bigger crystals. So it's kind of fun to play around with them and mix them to see what happens. This isn't going to happen right away. It's going to take maybe 10-15 minutes for us to start seeing the textures appear. So we'll let that sit, and eventually it's going to start showing us some cool stuff. In the meantime, we'll do some cheesecloth. So same thing, we'll start with wet on wet. So we need to start with just clean water. And then you're going to take a piece of cheesecloth, obviously cut to the size you need it. And then I'm just going to take this cloth and I'm just going to kind of pull it apart and warp it so that it's not so uniform. I can pull out strings, I can cut it and shape it to whatever sort of shape I want. And that's going to create sort of this interesting texture that we're going to get. So then I'm just going to place that on the water and tap it down just to hold it in place. And once I have that, then I'm going to start putting in color. And I want to use really saturated colors on the cheesecloth so that it will stick out more. And I'm just going to kind of dab the paint onto the cheesecloth. I'm going to use a variety of colors just to make it interesting. This one is really great when you are trying to make textures like rocks and other sorts of like geometric or I don't know, kind of hard looking shapes. So again, for this, you're going to want to work pretty wet but you also want to have a lot of paint in there too. So if it's too light, you won't be able to see the texture as well. So I'm going to put some kind of heavy text or heavy paint loads into this. It's always fun to kind of play with your colors too, because sometimes the colors separate in a really interesting manner. Alright, so now I'm going to take this plastic wrap and I'm just going to kind of crinkle it up and set it on top of my page. So you want to make sure that you have some areas that are touching it and some areas that aren't. So you can kind of move it around for a little bit, but you don't want to overdo it, otherwise you might lose the texture. So once you feel like you've got it in place, then just like the cheesecloth, you're going to let it sit. And it's going to take a while, so you have to be patient. So in the meantime, I'll just talk a little bit about some other stuff with watercolors. So I can put another layer of glaze over my glazing spot. Certain colors are more transparent than others. Some are more opaque. For example, the color I just put down, phthalo blue, is a staining color, so that one is really intense. Things like phthalo blue and quinacridone magenta, stuff like that, those don't come off, like they stay there forever. Other colors, you can kind of scrub them and lift them out. So you could have like a little scrubby brush. Say I didn't like some of this blue or green, I can just get a little water and scrub it and kind of erase it away. That's always great if you accidentally get stuff in a spot where you don't like it. But you don't want to overdo it because you might like rip off chunks of the paper. So if you don't have very heavy duty paper, that's going to be an issue. Some other things that are fun to work with would be masking fluid. So this is a brand that kind of works a lot with street art, and they give pens and all kinds of good stuff. So masking fluid is kind of like a way to keep your paper wet or white in areas where you don't want paint to be. So say I need this to stay the white of the paper. Otherwise, there's other ways you can apply it. You can use like a pen nib like this, and you can draw with that, or you can flick it on. When I'm painting things like grass, I have this nasty fan brush. You can see it's just covered in that masking fluid. I use that to just kind of make textures and work in layers and layers and layers to slowly build up the grass textures as I go along. But yeah, using these sort of like rubber nibs work really well when you're applying masking fluid if you don't have like a pen. So once this is dry, then I can paint over the top of that and show you how it works. That's kind of the thing about watercolor, is half of the process is just waiting. So I spend more than half of my time in the studio just watching paint dry. It's a life of excitement, that's for sure. So maybe I'll just glaze a little bit more. So sometimes I feel like glazing can give you much more exciting results than just mixing your paint together. I think while we're waiting, maybe I'll talk about a few other things. So one thing I really like to have when I am painting is a water bottle. Water bottles are awesome because they kind of help diffuse edges and stuff. So I can start by spraying in an area, and then I'll take a color and lay it down, and you can see how it just kind of explodes out when I do that. It gives you these sorts of really awesome, natural looking things. And you know, if I wanted to have more of those little bursts coming out, I can just go in and just really lightly spray it and it'll just pull the color out more. I think that's what I really love about watercolor, is the way that it can just explode on your page with color. I think that's really what draws me to working with it. It's super fun. So when I'm painting explosions, like I do in most of my watercolors, the water bottle is my friend. Alright, this is dry now, so I can just paint a color right over the top of that. So you can see how it just rejects the paint. So this is super helpful if you need areas to stay white, or if you're working on a background and you don't want to get stuff in the foreground dirty. Usually I always start with the background, so I tend to just block out all of the important stuff in the foreground so that I can work really messy like this, but still have crisp, clean edges on my figures and other important objects. And I think the last thing I'll talk about while I'm waiting for this all to dry is granulation. So a lot of colors that come from natural pigments do this thing called granulation, and it's where the pigment itself, or the minerals that are creating the color, tend to separate, and kind of like if you have a glass full of sand or something, and the sediments start to settle in the water. It's kind of the same sort of approach. So it's kind of a sciencey thing. So we'll see what happens when I lay this color down here. I believe this is Mars Black, if I recall correctly. And then I'm just going to introduce some water in here to make it really start to go. So you can see how all of the pigments in there start to separate. And if I were to just put some drops of water in here, it's going to push those little particles around. So we're getting all sciencey up in here. I think that's what's pretty awesome about art, is how much of it is science. And now we wait until all of this is dry. Once it's dry, then I will give you the big reveal of removing the cheesecloth and plastic wrap and masking fluid, and you can see what sorts of awesome textures they create. Thanks for being patient. Now it's time for the fun part. So first we'll start with masking fluid. I've got this like little eraser that I have for masking fluid. It works with rubber cement and stuff too. So I'm just going to rub across the masking fluid, and it just kind of sticks on there. And voila! Nice clean edges. Another thing that we can take a look at would be the salt. So we can kind of see how it's made these interesting crystal structures in the paint. You got to kind of scrub the salt off of the paper. We can also take a look at the granulation here. Notice how the particles of the pigment have kind of separated, and they make this almost wave-like sandy texture. So that's a pretty cool technique that just happens naturally. And now the extra satisfying parts. So the plastic wrap comes off pretty easily, but as you can see, it makes a pretty awesome texture. And then I love pulling the cheesecloth off. Give it a little scrub to get the final little pieces off of it. So as you can see, these make some really great textures with the cheesecloth and the plastic wrap. And there you have it. That's a basic rundown of textures and techniques with watercolors. Thanks for watching.